Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're embarking on a fascinating journey across one of the world's longest borders, but not to compare landscapes or cities. We're diving deep into the rich, complex, and distinct experiences of the indigenous peoples of North America, specifically the American Indians in the United States and the First Nations in Canada. You might think that because they share a continent, their stories are identical, but the truth is, the political, legal, and social landscapes they've navigated are worlds apart, shaped by two different colonial histories. This has created unique challenges and triumphs for each group, so grab a cup of tea, get comfortable, and let's explore these important distinctions together. First, let's talk terminology. It's a crucial starting point. In the United States, American Indian and Alaska Native are common legal and historical terms. You'll also hear Native American used widely, which is often seen as a more inclusive, modern term. However, the most respectful approach is always to refer to someone by their specific tribal nation, like Navajo, Cherokee, or Lakota, whenever possible. Now let's hop over the border to Canada. The term Indian is still used in a legal context, like in the Indian Act, but it's largely considered outdated and even offensive in casual conversation. The umbrella term used is Aboriginal peoples, which is enshrined in the Constitution and includes three distinct groups: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Today we're focusing on First Nations, who are the equivalent of what are called American Indians in the U.S. Just like in the States, specificity is key. Referring to the Cree, the Anishinaabe, or the Haida is always best. So, why the different names? It all goes back to history and the treaties signed or not signed with the colonizing powers. The relationship between indigenous peoples and the government in both countries has been defined by treaties, but the nature of these agreements differs significantly. In the United States, the treaty-making era was relatively short, officially ending in 1871. These treaties often involved massive land cessions in exchange for peace, small reserved lands known as reservations, and certain federal services. The U.S. government viewed tribes as domestic dependent nations. This created a unique political status, recognizing their sovereignty, but also placing them under the heavy hand of federal oversight. This relationship has been a constant push and pull, a struggle for self-determination against a backdrop of federal control. In Canada, the treaty process was more prolonged and geographically varied. Historic treaties, particularly in the Prairie Provinces and Northern Ontario, involved First Nations agreeing to share land in exchange for reserves, hunting and fishing rights, and annual payments. However, vast areas, like most of British Columbia, never had treaties, leading to modern-day land claim negotiations that are still ongoing. The Canadian approach has been described as recognizing Indigenous rights, but the implementation and honor of these treaties have been fraught with conflict and broken promises. This has led to a different legal landscape, where modern treaties and land claims are a major part of the ongoing reconciliation process. This brings us to one of the most significant differences: legal and political structures. In the U.S., the concept of tribal sovereignty is central. Federally recognized tribes have their own governments, laws, police forces, and courts. They operate as semi-autonomous nations within the borders of the United States. This sovereignty allows them to manage their own resources, run businesses like casinos, which have become a significant source of revenue for some, and govern their internal affairs. However, this sovereignty is constantly being challenged in the courts and by federal and state legislation. In Canada, the framework is different. The Indian Act of 1876, an incredibly paternalistic piece of legislation, has historically controlled almost every aspect of First Nations life, from who qualifies as the status Indian to how band councils are elected and how reserve lands are managed. While there have been amendments and a slow move towards self-government, the shadow of the Indian Act looms large. Self-government agreements are negotiated on a nation-by-nation basis, allowing First Nations to regain control over areas like education, healthcare, and local governance, but it's a slow and complex process, very different from the inherent sovereignty model in the U.S. Let's talk about land and resources. U.S. reservations are lands held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of the tribe. This trust status is a double-edged sword. It protects the land from being sold off or taxed by states, but it also means tribes often need federal approval for economic development projects, creating a lot of red tape. In Canada, reserve lands are also held by the Crown, but the legal framework is even more restrictive. The Indian Act has made it notoriously difficult for First Nations to leverage their land for economic gain. This has been a major barrier to prosperity. However, the recognition of Aboriginal title in areas without treaties has given some First Nations significant leverage in negotiations over resource development, like mining or forestry, on their traditional territories, which can extend far beyond their small reserve boundaries. What about social and cultural issues? Both American Indians and First Nations have faced devastating policies of assimilation. The residential school system in Canada and the boarding school system in the U.S. have the same tragic goal: to kill the Indian, save the man. These institutions inflict a deep intergenerational trauma that both communities are still healing from. However, the public reckoning with this history has unfolded differently. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which concluded in 2015, brought the horrors of residential schools to the forefront of the national conversation. Terms like cultural genocide and the 94 calls to action have become part of the mainstream vocabulary. There is a national day for truth and reconciliation, and the conversation, while difficult, is very public. In the United States, the awareness of the boarding school legacy is growing, but it hasn't reached the same level of national consciousness as in Canada. The recent federal Indian boarding school initiative is a crucial step in investigating these institutions, but the U.S. is arguably a few steps behind Canada in its national journey of acknowledgement and healing. This also extends to issues like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or MMIWG. In Canada, a national inquiry resulted in a massive report and has driven public awareness and policy discussions. In the U.S., the Savannas Act and the Not Invisible Act are more recent federal efforts to address a crisis that activists have been highlighting for decades. So, what does this all mean for people today? Despite facing different systems, Indigenous peoples in both countries share a common spirit of resilience, cultural revitalization, and a relentless fight for self-determination. They are reclaiming languages, revitalizing cultural practices, and asserting their rights on the national and international stage. From the land defenders at Standing Rock in the U.S. to the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in Canada, Indigenous peoples are on the front lines, protecting land and water for everyone. They are artists, entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers, and leaders who are shaping the future of their nations and the countries they live within. Understanding the differences between the experiences of American Indians and First Nations isn't just an academic exercise. It helps us appreciate the unique struggles each community faces and the specific, tailored solutions they're fighting for. It reminds us that Indigenous peoples are not a monolith. They are hundreds of distinct nations, each with its own history, culture, and path forward. By recognizing these nuances, we can be better allies and more informed citizens. We can support their calls for sovereignty, honor the treaties, and advocate for justice in ways that are respectful and relevant to their specific contexts. The border may be a line on a map, but the stories, struggles, and strengths of these nations are boundless. Thank you so much for joining me on this important discussion. I know it's a lot to take in, but these are conversations we need to be having. If you learned something new today, please please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might be interested. And of course, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next exploration. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.